Good evening. My name is Ralph Munion. I'm a parishioner of St. Andrew's, and it's a great pleasure to have the Reverend Dr. Sean Kim. Many of you know Sean. I've known Sean for at least a decade. First as a parishioner, and then as a good friend, fellow history buff, like I'm sure many of you are. That's why you're here. So it's great to have you all here as well. The microphone does work now, but Sean probably is going to take off his mask, right? So if you want to move back, you feel free to do that. Sean, I love talking to Sean. He's knowledgeable, insightful, and the guy's as humble as the day is long. So I know you'll like listening to him, and thank you again for being here, and you're on.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Is that too loud? Or? I am very excited to be back here at St. Andrew's, my home parish. I guess my first home parish. St. Mary's is my home parish now, but I see a lot of good friends, as well as a lot of new faces. My thanks to Ralph Munion and the other members of the Adult Christian Formation Commission for inviting me to talk this evening. It is truly an honor and a delight. I have to begin with an apology. I'm not going to talk on the topic that was publicized in the newsletter. Not exactly. I was scheduled to talk on the history of Protestant Christianity in Korea, and as I was preparing the talk, I realized that without looking at Roman Catholicism, which came about 100 years earlier, the story is really not complete, especially in providing the broader historical perspective, the big picture, if you will. So we will focus on Protestant Christianity, but you'll also get quite a bit of Roman Catholicism as well. The topic of Korean Christianity is one that is very close to my heart. As some of you know, I grew up in Independence, Missouri, but I was born in Seoul, South Korea. And even after moving to the States, my parents attended a Korean church. So I'll be sharing with you really a part of my own spiritual heritage. And I'll try to point out some ways in which my own family history intersects with the topic we're talking about, history of Christianity in Korea. The topic is also one that has intellectual significance for me. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the history of Protestant Christianity in Korea, and I'll be spending the rest of my career studying it from various angles. So I'm very excited that you provided me with the opportunity to present on this topic. The challenge, of course, will be to be brief. Giving an academic free rein to talk about his research topic, right, Van? I mean, that's but I will try to be as brief as possible. Ralph, you recommend about 40 minutes, right, for the presentation. And then I'd like to have as much time as possible for questions and discussion. I mean, that's where it gets really fun, so rather than me just lecturing. Korea, and here's a map of North and South Korea, and then East Asia, or Asia, in the back. As you can see, the Korean peninsula juts out at the northeast kind of corner of the Eurasian landmass. Korea, and I should qualify, South Korea after 1945, but prior to 1945, of course, before 1945, Korea was just one country, and then it was divided. Northern Korea was actually the seat of Protestant as well as Catholic Christianity. And then things changed after the communists took over. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. Korea represents one of the greatest success stories in the history of Christian missions. Estimates put the number of Christians at almost a third of the population, and most Asian countries today are still Buddhist or Shinto, and so to have a third of your population, that's highly significant. About 9 million Protestants and 5 million Roman Catholics for a total of around 14 million Christians. The population of South Korea is around 50 million. And so roughly one out of every three, about 30%, is Christian, either of Roman Catholic or Protestant variety. Now we have to keep in mind that this is a country that for centuries, in fact in the case of Buddhism and Confucianism, over a millennium, Buddhist, Confucian, shamanistic. So Christianity being a late arrival has had spectacular success in Korea. So as I mentioned earlier, North Korea, let me give you a little kind of history of Korea, the political history of Korea. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was part of the Japanese colonial empire. It was taken over in 1910, became a colony. And then in 1945, the Russians liberated the northern part of Korea, and then the south was liberated by the Americans, similar to Germany, right? You have East and West Germany. So in northern Korea, with the communist government, it became increasingly difficult for Christians to live there. And eventually it was rooted out, eradicated in the north. So most of my comments today on the history of Christianity will be about South Korea. Although there are some kind of model churches, mainly to showcase to the international community up there in the north. There is no significant Christian population, or for that matter, Buddhist or any other religion. And you hear a lot about Kim Jong-un, right, and all the craziness up there in North Korea. The capital city of Seoul boasts the 5 largest churches in the world, including the largest, what happened to my slideshow? Sorry. Having some technical difficulties. Oh, sorry. So the Yeouido Full Gospel Church. Yeouido is a large island in the middle of Seoul. Full Gospel Church. This is an aerial view. I was just talking with Doc Worley. This is the church you and Reverend Black went to, right? At its peak, it had over 800,000 members. Of course, that included satellite churches as well. It has declined a little bit, so it's around 500,000. So still, it's huge. So this is the largest church in the world, and Seoul also has the largest Presbyterian church and the largest Methodist church. So I'm going to talk about mega churches. Now, the founder of Yeouido Full, it's a Pentecostal church, Paul Youngi Cho, just died within the last week or so. And I had no idea he died until Margaret Clark, my good friend, sent me the New York obituary. So he was 85, but died fairly recently. The explosion of Christianity in Korea has spilled over abroad. Wherever Koreans have gone, they have planted their churches. The Kansas City area is home to around 30 Korean congregations. I grew up in one of them. It used to sit on the corner of 81st and Holmes. I think there's an Anglican church right across the street. And even in Warrensburg, where I teach, University of Central Missouri, I believe there are 2 Korean Baptist churches. What I'd like to do today is to trace the history of Christianity in Korea from its beginnings to the present, and also raise some major issues and themes. In particular, the issue of church growth and expansion. So the big question is, how did all this happen? And why, right? And that's the question that a lot of scholars have been asking, as well as just ordinary people. Dr. Worley talked about flying into Seoul and seeing a sea of red neon crosses, right? I mean, it's quite dramatic, the ubiquitous presence of Christianity in Korea. So since we're doing a couple of centuries of history, I'll be painting with very broad brushstrokes. So if at any point if something's unclear, if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me. I've tried to limit my prepared comments, so please feel free to stop me. We'll begin with Roman Catholicism. The first Christians to step foot on Korean soil came as part of an invading army. In the late 16th century, Japan launched a massive invasion of its neighbor Korea in an attempt to march on China. Japan was being ruled by a megalomaniac, Hideyoshi, and he had dreams of conquering China, and Korea stood in the way, right? So he wanted to go through, and the Koreans said no. And so he unleashed his seasoned samurai warriors on Korea and absolutely decimated the population, and Korea never fully recovered from the Japanese invasions. Many of the samurai warriors were Roman Catholics who had been converted by Jesuit missionaries. The Jesuits had a very active mission in Japan in the 1500s. It was part of the age of discovery and expansion. So the Portuguese and the Spanish, when they came to Japan, they brought Jesuit missionaries. So Christianity in Japan thrived. The 16th century is often called the Christian century in Japan. So serving the Japanese Christian samurai in Korea was a Japanese Jesuit priest named Gregorius Cespedes. We have no record of his working with the Koreans. His charge was to minister to Japanese troops. But the invasion did produce the first group of Korean Catholics. Many of the hostages, the war prisoners who were taken back to Japan, converted. And in the persecution of Christianity in Japan that followed in the 17th century, there were numerous Korean martyrs who died for the Christian faith. Have any of you seen this fairly recent film by Martin Scorsese called Silence? Came out in 2016. It is based on a novel by a Roman Catholic novelist by the same title, Silence. And the backdrop is the persecution of the Christians in Japan. And it focuses on these Jesuit missionaries. But it's an excellent film. And in fact, it's rare that a movie is better than the novel. The movie is better than the novel, I mean, at least in my opinion. The next chapter in the history of Christianity began over a century later, and the faith trickled in from Korea's other neighbor, China. So, the first Roman Catholic presence, ironically, came through invaders. And then, in the 18th century, Korean embassy officials who had been dispatched to the Chinese court in Beijing came across the writings of Jesuit missionaries. I mean, the Jesuits, they're an extraordinary group. I mean, they went to Latin America and Asia and Africa and had no fear, and highly intelligent men. I mean, these are men of the Renaissance who came not just with their religion but their science as well. And so Koreans, these officials, intellectuals, Confucian intellectuals, came across the writings of Jesuit missionaries and took some of these Catholic books and catechisms and even some holy objects back with them to Korea. And from that, a small community of believers started to form based on reading these limited books and catechisms, even before the arrival of missionaries. So long before any priest or missionary arrived in Korea, as a result of books that had trickled in, you have small communities of believers, and some of them even started to baptize each other and doing certain sacramental functions that would have horrified the Catholic hierarchy. Eventually, missionaries did arrive, and the faith started to spread. Now, I don't have time to get into all the reasons why Catholicism was successful in Korea, but scholars believe one of the main reasons for the appeal was the idea of equality. It was a religion that preached that all are children of God and that we can all be saved. Now, this flied in the face of traditional Korean culture because, on the one hand, it's highly patriarchal. Confucianism was the kind of state ideology, and women really had no place in Confucianism, except as good mothers and good wives. No schools for women. Public service was completely closed out to women. And even in traditional Buddhism, woman could not achieve salvation unless she was reborn as a man. Right? So imagine if you're a woman, you encounter Catholicism, you have nuns, and this idea was quite radical. And also, any of you fans of Korean Netflix dramas, and it's all about class. It's like Downton Abbey, And what's interesting is that the dramas take place in contemporary Korea. Like Samsung and Hyundai, these are, still owned largely by these families, these corporate families. And they live like Downton Abbey. I just recently started watching one called Mine, M-I-N-E. The class consciousness is just, it's still around. And so when Catholicism first came to Korea, the aristocracy refused to worship together with the peasants. I mean, you just don't do that. And I think a similar situation existed in India, right? The caste system, right? High caste Brahmins, it's unthinkable for them to sit next. But Catholicism, Protestantism said, we're all equal, in terms of our faith. So it's quite radical. And you can see how this radical message of equality had a powerful appeal, especially to the marginalized and the oppressed. So women, the poor, and Korea had a huge slave population. So slaves, they enslaved their own. I mean, there was no ethnic difference. The ruling elite, on the other hand, found Christianity dangerous and subversive. The official ideology was, as I mentioned, Confucianism, and they found Christianity objectionable at many levels. First, the Confucian scholar officials tended to be they're very well educated and very rational and skeptical. So when they encountered Christian beliefs like miracles and resurrection, heaven and hell, they dismissed it as superstition. But what offended the Confucians more than anything else was that they perceived Christianity to be a violation of filial piety. The cornerstone of Confucian morality is filial piety, respect for one's parents. So for Confucians, the most important responsibility for a man is to marry and carry on the line by producing a son. Okay? So when the Confucians saw celibate Catholic priests, monks, and nuns, like they're violating their filial duties. You're insulting your parents. So they were immoral. And this was the same criticism leveled against Buddhist monks and nuns. So during the last Korean dynasty, which lasted from 1392 to 1910, Buddhism was also marginalized. And so Catholicism, in the eyes of many Confucians, was just another variety of Buddhism. They have rosaries and celibate clergy and so on. So Catholicism suffered the same kind of stigma that Buddhism suffered in Korea at this time. Christianity also violated filial piety by rejecting the time-honored tradition of ancestral rights. So just a brief explanation of the ancestral rights, and Koreans and Chinese still do this, especially in traditional families. So on the anniversary of the death of a loved one, you set out a table with food and alcohol, like wine, and you also have what's known as a spirit tablet, although these days sometimes they'll have a photograph of the deceased loved one. And then the male members, now these days women are also participating, but it used to be women prepare the food on the table, but they were not allowed to participate in the ancestral rites. The male members would bow before the table. Now the roots of this are in ancient China, where the Chinese believed that the ghosts of the deceased would actually partake of the food. But then the Confucians, as I mentioned, they're quite rational. They just saw it as symbolic, right? Now the problem for the Catholics was when the Jesuits first arrived, a lot of the Jesuits were quite open-minded and inclusive, sensitive to Korean culture. And actually the dispute occurred in China earlier. So the Jesuits had no problem with ancestral rights. Whatever the origins may be, this is just a sign of respect. You kowtow to the emperor, you bow to people. There's nothing wrong with that. So the Jesuits allow their Catholic converts to continue the ancestral rites. But then one of the popes, I forget his name, reversed the Vatican's attitude toward ancestral rites and said it's idolatrous. So all converts from this point on, you will not participate. So by the time Catholicism entered Korea, ancestral rites were prohibited. And in fact, some of the zealous converts smashed the ancestral tablets. So you can imagine the Confucian reaction to this, right? It is subversive. It is dangerous. They're a bunch of loonies. How can you not? We've been doing this for centuries, and it's a sign of respect. And you have this new religion comes in, and so as a result of what the government saw as a direct assault on the social and moral order, they began a series of persecutions. In the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, thousands perished in the persecutions that followed. And interestingly, this is about the time, Tom, you were asking about Vietnam. Vietnam was also carrying out anti-Catholic persecutions in Vietnam, although that situation was a little different because it was also Confucian. But then the French army came in and took over as a result of the Confucian persecution of Christianity. The persecution of Catholics by the Confucian government in Korea produced many martyrs, many saints. And Korea right now has 103 saints. And I love this painting. This is in the center. Can you hear me without the mic? Okay. This is the first Korean priest, Andrew Kim. And as you can see, there are some Westerners, French. The Korea Catholic mission was led by mostly French orders. So you have Frenchmen, but you also have little children. And you have, as I mentioned earlier, because of the idea of equality, you did have some aristocrats who converted. And so the dress is quite different between a commoner and an aristocrat. And something else I love about this is look at the angels.
Yes.
Right? The iconography, this is East Asian. These are kind of traditional Chinese, Korean, supernatural, angelic, like heavenly beings. It's a beautiful, it's a mural in one of the Catholic churches in Seoul. Pope Francis visited Korea in 2014, and he beatified 124 more. So, and of course, beatification is a stage before canonization, so Korea will probably have more saints. This is a service in the main cathedral in Seoul, Myeongdong Cathedral. And can anyone figure out what service is being conducted here? See, yes, ordinary, right, prostration, and you have, right. The persecutions decimated the Catholic population in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, it started to gradually grow again. The most dramatic growth came in the late 20th century. One of the explanations for the growth is the association of Catholicism with the democratic movement in South Korea. From the 1960s to the 1980s, South Korea had dictator after dictator, a military dictator. The Catholic Church was at the forefront of the protests for democratic government. And so Myeongdong Cathedral became a haven from those fleeing government, mostly students and political activists. And in fact, the Cardinal Stephen Kim himself was persecuted by the dictators. And so Catholicism became a champion of democracy. And as a result, after the dictatorships ended in 1987-88, the general population associated Catholicism with democracy. And so there's been, in fact, right now, the Catholic Church is growing faster than the Protestant Church in Korea. Joy, did you have a question?
I just keep looking at the icons up above. They're like 12, are those 12 apostles?
Yes, right.
And they look like Byzantine. Is it Byzantine or Byzantine?
I'm not an art historian. Does anyone know? Yeah, it does look Byzantine, right.
It looks like it would be from Rome or something.
Right,
And
right.
I don't know, that's pretty cool.
right.
Okay.
Right. Now, I mean, that's an interesting question because I'll talk more about this in a minute, but the enculturation, I pointed you to the East Asian iconography, but another reason why the Catholics didn't grow as fast in the pre-World War II period was they continued to have mostly foreign clergy, Western clergy. Whereas the Protestants were very quick to hand the reins over to, native Korean evangelists. But the Catholics and the Anglicans were very slow to produce an indigenous clergy. And I think they also tended to cling on more to kind of Western forms of church architecture, and it's reflected in other ways as well. I mean, it's beautiful inside, but right, I mean, I think that's kind of an exact imitation what you would see in the Vatican. Yeah. Okay, now we turn to Protestantism. I think I'm doing okay in terms of time. Protestantism was introduced to Korea about a century after Roman Catholicism in the late 19th century. It has a very different history. But one aspect that is the same for the Protestants as well as the Catholics is the fact that the original initiative came from the Koreans rather than from foreign missionaries. Just as Catholicism began in Korea when some Koreans brought back Catholic books from China and started forming Catholic communities, Protestantism began when some Koreans, this time merchants, peddlers, who were trading in China along the Manchurian border, they encountered Western missionaries. I think a Scottish missionary was up there and American missionaries, and they helped them translate the Bible into Korean. Okay? So while they were in Manchuria, and then they brought these Bibles into Korea and started forming Protestant communities. So again, as with the Catholics, with the Protestants as well, you already had Protestant communities even before the arrival of formal missionaries. When the first missionaries did arrive, beginning in the 1880s, they were fully aware of the persecution of the Catholics that had taken place for decades. So they took a very, very cautious approach. And also they had the wisdom of lessons learned from Japan and China. So, there are advantages to being a latecomer. Protestantism had entered China and Japan decades before. And the missionaries, shared that information, lessons learned. So for one, the Protestants distanced themselves from the Catholics. And after all, this is the late 19th century, right? Protestants didn't consider Catholics to be Christian, right? And this is still reflected in the Chinese and Korean language, where the term for Christian refers almost exclusively to Protestants. And there's a separate term for Catholics. Actually in Japan as well. This is as a result of the Protestant bias. And so when the Protestant missionaries, mostly Presbyterian and Methodists, when they arrived in Korea, they said, Catholics, that's a different religion altogether. There may be some resemblances, but no, we don't, venerate Mary and rosary and celibacy and all that. No, right? This is a totally different religion. So they distanced themselves from and Catholicism was legally prohibited at this time. Right? So they were being very shrewd. Secondly, and this is much, much more important, they established goodwill with the Koreans, especially with those in power, before beginning direct evangelization. So they felt that the Catholics made the mistake of just kind of entering in there at the grassroots level, and then, cultural confrontation and so on. So, and they paved the way with what's called, the Protestant missionaries, paved the way with what's called indirect evangelization, medical and educational work. So long before they started distributing Bibles and converting, they built hospitals and schools. In fact, the Protestant missionaries established the first modern Western-style hospitals and schools in Korea and trained the first generation of physicians, nurses, and educators. Stuck again, sorry. Oh. So this is Severance Hospital in Seoul. Does the name Severance ring a bell with anybody? Why is a Korean hospital called Severance? It's obviously not Korean, right? Have any of you heard of Louis Severance? Louis Severance? He was one of the founders of Standard Oil. So he put up the money. And Horace and Allen, who was one of the first missionaries and Presbyterian missionaries, he did the fundraising, and Severance put up most of the money. Severance Hospital is the first Western-style hospital to be built in Korea in the late 19th century. And some personal kind of connections here. I was born in Severance Hospital. And also my father went to a couple of years of medical school until, they started dissecting corpses and things, and he decided to go into business. and so he did a couple of years of training here at Severance. So I feel a kind of a personal connection to Severance Hospital. This is a photograph, I think, from the 1930s of Sungsil Normal School in Pyongyang. It's a Protestant mission school established by Presbyterians. It was a boys' school. And during the Korean War, it went south. So there's a Sungsil University. So a lot of these schools that were originally established as elementary schools or normal schools, right? They became, now they're universities and colleges. And again, a personal connection here. I had a great uncle who taught at Sungsil. He was the music teacher, vocal, also taught soccer. And when I was doing research for my dissertation, I was looking through some official Presbyterian histories, and there was this group photo of a soccer team that won the empire-wide championship, so they beat all the Japanese teams. And so I took it home, and my dad said, "That's my uncle there." I was like, wow. And we were also able to track down some, he was a vocalist, so we were able to even track down some recordings from the 1930s. It was really odd, like one of the tunes was set to Dixie. It must have been kind of Southern Presbyterian missionaries, but it was like a religious, like a hymn set to the tune of Dixie. It's weird. Now, sadly, tragically, this great uncle, when the communists came and occupied northern Korea, they carted him off to a Siberian work camp. So, I mean, the Russians did that with a lot of the dissidents. They were sent to Siberian labor camps. And I was just having a conversation with Dr. Clark here, and Margaret, you mentioned the Koreans in Russia who were persecuted by Stalin. So there were probably a couple of million Koreans in eastern Russia. And under Stalin, they were forcibly removed because, the 1930s, 40s, Korea was under Japanese rule. So even Koreans living in Russia were considered Japanese subjects. And so they were forcibly removed. They thought they would be spying right along the border. So hundreds of thousands were put into trains and carted off to Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and other states in Central Asia. So if you go to Central Asia today, there's a huge Korean ethnic population there. The Protestants had an especially dramatic impact on the education of women. I just mentioned that the Confucians had no schools for women whatsoever. And so the only way that a woman could learn how to read or write was to sit out on lessons of their male siblings. So wealthy aristocratic households would hire a private tutor and to teach, reading and writing and all. And so the daughters might be allowed to sit in, but not ask any questions. You can't say anything. But remarkably, a lot of women became great scholars this way. And so we do have some very rich women's literature, although there were no formal schools. But the Protestant missionaries changed all that. They started schools for girls and for women. And so today, the largest women's university in the world is one that was founded by an American missionary, Mary Scranton. This is a photo from, I believe, the 1920s. 18,000 students, all female, right? And a beautiful campus right in the heart of Seoul. So the Protestant missionaries did a lot of good, medical work, educational work, and then they started evangelizing. And as I mentioned earlier, unlike the Catholics and the Anglicans, the Protestant Presbyterian Methodist missionaries, it takes a long time to learn a foreign language, and especially to preach in a foreign language. And so they said, okay, we're not gonna mess with this. They recruited young Koreans, and a lot of women as well. There's this interesting phenomenon known as the Bible women, where women, in particular widows or single women, were recruited to accompany female missionaries. There was strict gender segregation, so to accompany female missionaries and translate, and also earn a side income selling Bibles. And so that they were called Bible women. But in some rural areas, they became the pastors of churches. And so, of course, the official hierarchy didn't recognize them as reverend or minister, but for all intents and purposes, there were these so-called Bible women who would lead, in some cases, large rural congregations. There's any of you fans of George Eliot? In Adam Bede, there's a wonderful scene in which there's an early Methodist female preacher preaching in the fields. And then later on, the Methodist hierarchy came and said, women can't preach anymore. So by the end of the novel, she can't preach. But a similar thing happened in Korea as well. So the Protestant church in Korea, from the outset, did remarkably well. And so, within the first decade or two of missions, there's all this literature among missionaries about Korea. In fact, some were so optimistic they believed that Korea would become 100% Protestant within a generation or two, but it didn't happen, right? Although later on, there was a spectacular growth. So the latter half of the 20th century, 1950s, 60s, and 70s, South Korea was the fastest growing Protestant nation in the world, doubling every decade. Okay? And there are two major theories. Now we're getting to the question of why. Why South Korea became so Christian, so Protestant in the latter half of the 20th century. One is a political explanation and the other is a cultural one. The first one deals with nationalism. Right? I know these days we hear a lot about white nationalism and it's not a positive term, but for Koreans living under Japanese colonial rule, nationalism was the way you resisted Japanese colonialism. And here's a kind of unique situation, well, not absolutely unique, but in Korea, the evil imperialists were not the Westerners. They were not the British or the French. Right? In most parts of the world, like Africa and Asia, who were the imperialists in the late 19th century? Western Europeans. But in Korea, you have this interesting situation where your neighbor colonized you. So the Japanese are, the villains, and the missionaries who are setting up hospitals and schools and teaching Western ideals of democracy and nation building and all of that, they're our friends. And so many of the leading nationalists during the colonial period were Protestants. In fact, the Korean Declaration of Independence, in 1919, the Koreans staged this massive demonstration against Japanese colonial rule. Over 1 million people participated. And there was a Declaration of Independence, 33 signatories. I believe 19 or 20 of those signatories were Protestants. And this was at a time when Protestantism was less than 1% of the population. So there's a very strong connection with Korean nationalism. And so because the Koreans perceived Protestantism as an ally or friend of our people, right, our Koreans, this predisposed them very favorably to embracing the faith. So that's one theory. The other theory is enculturation. And what I mean by this is Christianity incorporating, assimilating many aspects of traditional Korean religion and culture. So the conventional view of Protestantism in particular is that it's culturally imperialist. They just go in there and tell them, you have to Westernize, you have to embrace, give up all of your traditional culture. That wasn't true in Korea. And this goes back to the fact that the Western missionaries largely relinquished their kind of direct evangelization to native Koreans. And so many of these native Korean preachers and evangelists didn't have really thorough kind of Western theological training. And so they kind of made things up, if you will, as they encounter situations. So let me give you some examples of this enculturation. If you're a devout Korean Protestant today, you have to wake up really, really early in the morning to attend what's known as early dawn prayer at 4 a.m. Every day, 7 days, early dawn prayer for prayer and word, and it's usually an hour-long or 2-hour service. Many scholars, you don't really, you have Easter sunrise service, but 4 a.m. every day. A lot of scholars of religion see kind of folk religious practice here. Because in certain strains of shamanism, the gods are most awake very early in the morning, right? So you pray, and the optimum time is 4 a.m. in the morning. Korean Protestantism, and again, this cuts across. It's not just Pentecostals, but even Presbyterians and Methodists place great emphasis on the supernatural. Or maybe I should say the immediacy of the supernatural, because to believe in God it's supernatural, right? But the kind of immediacy, direct experience of the supernatural, divine healing. So the Full Gospel Church, he was a great healer. That was one of the main reasons why people converted. The healings, the dramatic, what we used to call faith healing or divine healing, dreams and visions, and other gifts of the Spirit. And this really took off in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the Presbyterians and Methodists pretty much had a hegemony prior to that, and then the Pentecostals and Assemblies of God came in, and it just really took off. Now, many of these healings take place not just through prayer, but exorcisms. And we have exorcisms in the West as well. But what's really distinctive about the exorcisms that take place in Korean Protestant circles is that the possessing spirits are sometimes identified as those of your dead relatives. So, the aunt that you offended, now she's dead, she's come to possess you. So dead relatives with grudges. I get that. Right? So again, I'm sorry?
Did you say grudges?
Grudges, yeah. Ghost spirits with grudges, they'll come and possess you. And so Pentecostal, as well as some, like mainline, they'll use Jesus' name to exorcise, like, the spirit of your dead aunt or uncle or whatnot. Now, I'm going to conclude by a very brief survey of Anglicanism. We're mostly Episcopalians here, so a survey of Korean Christianity would not be complete without Anglicanism. But I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible. Together with the Orthodox Church, so there is a small Orthodox Church in Korea, begun by Russian missionaries, because Korea borders Russia. So the Orthodox and the Anglican are the only two non-evangelical churches in Korea. Even the Presbyterians, the Methodists are evangelical. And by evangelical, it's really hard to define, but most scholars would define evangelical as emphasis on personal conversion, right? You have like a born-again experience, conservative theology, and also emphasis on witnessing. And this is another key to the growth. Everybody is encouraged to witness and bring people to church, and especially family members. Bringing family members and having them convert. So the Anglican Church is not evangelical, and it's very, at least its roots are very high church, Anglo-Catholic. Compared to the two big denominations, the Presbyterian Methodist, each number in the millions, Anglican Church is quite small, only about 65,000 members, and it's divided into 3 dioceses, centered on Busan, and Busan is the main port, Seoul, and then Daegu. One of the distinctive aspects of Anglicanism in Korea is the great sensitivity to Korean culture. In fact, the church has produced some really fine Western scholars of Korean literature. One of the bishops, Richard Rutt, has translated all this traditional poetry and literature. Another bishop, Mark Napier Trollope. Any of you Anthony Trollope fans, Victorian novelist? He was the nephew of Trollope, but he was a bishop in the 1920s and 30s, and he studied everything from Korean religion to botany, and so great love and passion for Korean culture. And here's a kind of a so this is kind of an example of a typical Korean service. It's very dramatic and emotional, and they have what's known as, I don't know how you would translate it, audible prayer, where you all pray out really loud. right? Not in unison, but you pray your own individual prayer really loud. This is the Anglican Church on the island of Ganghwa, which is not too far from Seoul. But as you can see, this is from 1900. It opened in 1900. And the Anglicans, and most of them were British, they felt, well, we don't want to create a Western house of worship, so we'll use traditional Korean architecture. And so they used some of the same kind of blueprint as some of the royal palaces. So it's really beautiful, and it still stands today on Ganghwa. And here you have Korea's first native Anglican clergy, Mark Kim in the middle. Then I forget the names of the deacons. This is the Anglican Cathedral in Seoul, and it's the, Vin, you would be interested since you're an architectural historian, only example of Romanesque architecture in all of East Asia. And it's quite beautiful. And there's a convent that's attached to the cathedral, and I had a chance to go in, and the convent is built in the traditional Korean style. And I met this wonderful nun who was living there, and she was sharing stories of the Korean War, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. I think I've talked long enough, so I hope you have a good overview of Christianity. I'd be happy to entertain questions and any comment. Susan, yes.
I was just wondering how the Anglican Church has done with the ordination of Korean people. You said that the Protestants and Methodists,
Right. So they're kind of in between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. So this photo is, the previous photo is taken from 1920s. So I think the Anglicans have been a little bit better than the Romans in ordaining indigenous clergy, but still they lag far behind the other Protestant denominations. And of course, there's more training involved, I think, especially like sacramental aspects. And so it takes a longer period. Yes, Doc Worley.
The one thing that Jeff Black and I found most difficult to get used to was we were invited to go with the group to one of the 125,000 people in the Olympic Stadium.
Oh, Olympic Stadium. Oh, really?
Full of people, 125,000 worshipers. And then every time they would say, the guy that was in charge would say something which we didn't know what to say. And then they'd ring a little bell, and they'd ding, ding.
Right.
And everyone would start praying out loud.
Yeah, yes, right.
125,000 people praying at top speed.
And sometimes,
It was disconcerting.
right. So the church that I grew up in, we kind of missed out on the Pentecostal wave that swept into Presbyterian churches, and so it's very similar to a Presbyterian church, here in the States. And then I went off to college, and I went to like a retreat where where the people who gathered there had been more influenced by the kind of Pentecostalism. So we were in a room about this size, and there were probably 30 or 40 of us, and they started doing that. They rang a bell, and everybody's crying, not crying, but praying out loud. That was okay, but then they turned off the light, and the minister came around and started hitting some of us, like on the back. And I don't know if it was a form of healing, or, it was just, I think, but it was like actually striking, like on the back. And I don't know if, now again, maybe there's some Buddhistic influence, because in a Zen monastery, and you go to meditate and you fall asleep and they whack you with a stick to wake you up, right? So I don't know if it's kind of borrowing from that. I haven't really studied that, but right, the Audible Prayer, it's quite right. It's a cacophony. Like everybody's praying something, and then they'll ring a bell, and it all stops. Right. And some will speak in tongues, and it's kind of, yes.
I had no idea they could be speaking
Yes, Rita.
I have seen recordings of Korean churches singing gospel music, like
Oh.
black gospel music.
Oh,
Very
yes.
traditional. And the choirs were really quite good. I mean, they had the movements, they
Mm-hmm.
had tamarines.
Yes.
And
Uh-huh.
so that influence is very interesting.
Yes. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, there's no direct connection to the African American church, right? So now I think maybe there are a lot of Korean Protestant clergy who are trained in the United States. So even here in Kansas City, if you go to St. Paul's Methodist Seminary or Midwest Baptist, there are a lot of Korean students. In fact, even Princeton Theological Seminary, I think they would be really hard pressed, in terms of finances without Korean students. So because of the U.S. training, I can see, some of those ministers trained in the United States learning gospel. And, like music ministry is very, very important. So I think that's probably the more likely connection, where you learn that in the United States, especially like in music programs, and then you take that back. Yeah. Yes. Or in the back.
I was just gonna say, I just graduated from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur,
Oh, yes.
Presbyterian Seminary.
Uh-huh.
And like a full third of the seminary is South Korean students.
Yes.
Who
Yes.
have every intention of returning to South
Yes.
Korea for their ministry.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
And they are, just from my own experience, they're very into sort of contemporary Christian
Yes.
styles of worship.
Right. Yes.
They like that sort of music, and when the Korean students would lead worship, it would often be sort of contemporary Christian worship.
Mm-hmm.
They answered.
Oh, yes. So the largest Korean American church here in Kansas City is called Mission Church, and you can Google it. I think it's called Korean Mission Church. And it's near Christ Church Anglican, like Knoll and 95th, that area. It's kind of set back, but it's mostly contemporary music. And so they have guitars and, right. Ralph, yes.
Do you have any sense of the status of the persecuted church in North Korea and in concentration camps?
Oh,
Any
yes.
sense of that, or?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to know because they don't allow any information to escape. Although, recently there have been a lot of defectors, people who've managed to escape not only the concentration camps but North Korea, and have come to the United States or South Korea. And so there are quite a few books as well as interviews with defectors, and it's. And that's why, at the beginning of my presentation, I said it's been eradicated, because whatever churches that they may show to foreigners, the people who actually go to worship there say, well, these people don't really know, what they're singing, or, it's all for show. But from the defectors, there's still very fierce persecution of Christians.
I know some Koreans who are involved in sending Christian missionaries
Oh,
to
yes.
Korea.
Right. That's something I wasn't able to deal with in my lecture, but South Korea is number 2 or 3 in the number of missionaries that are sent abroad. I think the U.S. sends around 127,000 missionaries abroad, and South Korea, number has declined a little bit, but anywhere from 20 to 30,000. And I think Brazil's up there as well. So, and a lot of the missionaries are coming to Europe and the United States because they feel that, the West has lost its vitality. So we need to kind of re-inject true Christianity. So you find a lot of Korean missionaries in the United States as well as in Europe, and also in the Middle East. And so there have been a number of missionaries who have been killed in Iraq or Iran and parts of the Middle East where there's a clear prohibition against evangelizations, and the Koreans will actually go in there and try to proselytize. Yes. Joy, yes.
Okay, I hope I can make sense of this question. So when you talk about the time-honored belief in Confucius,
Mhm.
honoring family.
Mhm.
And then if you introduce Christianity into families and villages and cities, is there a conflict between hangers-on of Confucianism
Mhm.
with Christianity and how they kind of
Right.
can get along?
Right. So on the one hand, you can have, I guess you can call it Confucianism light, where you don't take the ancestor veneration and all of that, but the emphasis on respect for parents and harmony, and Confucianism has a lot of positive. I mean, I portrayed it pretty negatively, but I think in some ways I'm still kind of Confucian, like in terms of family values, and so it's there's a kind of heritage. I think almost all Koreans and Chinese are Confucian in some way, in terms of family values and respect for elders and education, right? But on the issue of ancestral ritual, in spite of the bloody past of Roman Catholic experience with ancestor veneration, now the Roman Catholic Church has again reversed its position. So they have ancestral rights. I mean, Catholics can perform them. And now most of the Protestants feel, no, we're not going to, set food and bow, and that smacks of idolatry. And so, but they've adapted it, where they've left out the most offensive, but they'll have memorial services. So like on the anniversary of the death of a parent, they'll call the minister, they'll have food. They won't bow to it, but they'll have food and maybe a photo. And so kind of watered down ancestral. So Confucianism continues to exert an influence even among Protestants. Yeah.
It's almost like I'm thinking of Latinos, the Day of the Dead, when
Yes,
you build
right,
altars,
right,
and you
right,
venerate
right,
your ancestors, and
right,
light the candles and put
right,
food, and
right. Yes,
it's
it is.
almost global.
It is. It's very local, right? Mhm.
Sean, it seems to me that one of the biggest effects of Confucian values in East Asia is education.
Yes, yes. Although I think in some ways it's become distorted. Although even in original Confucianism, it was already getting distorted. So the Confucian view of education is that learning transforms you. It's not just accumulation of knowledge, but just the process. So the more learned a person is, the more moral that person is. That's the assumption. And so they believe that the best kind of government is to have the best educated, because of course, we know that's not true, right? The most educated aren't the most virtuous, but at least, I'm sorry, we can try. But then during in traditional China and Korea, they had what was known as a civil service exam system. So they would recruit officials based on exams, like the SAT or the ACT. But these were Confucian texts and Confucian classical texts. And so eventually Confucian learning degenerated into, knowing enough to get high marks on the exam to become a top official. It became kind of, and what that has happened, I think, in recent times, you've heard of these scandals involving college admissions, and a lot of them are Asians, right? Like Chinese Americans, giving like $1 million to try to get their kid into, and so unfortunately, I think there's a kind of a legacy of the kind of Confucian. It's positive, but it can also turn into this where you turn it education into an instrument for status, like wealth and status, right? You try to get into the best schools possible and become lawyer, doctor. I mean, it's status driven, but you find that in original kind of traditional Chinese and Korean society as well. And so you go to Japan or Korea, and they have what's known as Exam Hell Week, where high school seniors, it's just, and churches and temples are filled with mothers praying for their children to do well on the exams. And the Japanese and Korean system, there's no room for late bloomers. because law school, medical school, it's all at the undergraduate level. So, getting into the school of your choice as an undergraduate, it makes or breaks you. I mean, there's no, doing undergrad and then studying, later going to medical school. It's all at the undergraduate level. So like 6-year medical programs and so there's tremendous pressure put on kids to perform. And unfortunately, I think some of that has blown here to the United States.
What about Buddhism? If you mentioned it, I missed it.
Right, so Buddhism, I mentioned it in passing, the last Korean dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, 1392 to 1910, what was thoroughly Confucian. So they saw Buddhism as immoral and as subversive. And so Buddhist temples were not allowed in the capital. They were banned to the mountains. So it was really marginalized. But in modern times, Buddhism has experienced a kind of revival. South Korea is very interesting in that you have a truly religiously plural society. I mean, in the West, you often talk about religious pluralism and ethnic pluralism, but you don't really have it. I mean, you have like a dominant religion. But in South Korea, I think the Buddhists number roughly the same as the Catholics or Protestants. And so you have almost a kind of equal division of the population into Christian, Buddhist, and then no religion at all. So, it is truly kind of diverse and plural.
Is there Christian K-pop?
Yes, of course. K-pop. Yes, I haven't seen it, but I'm almost positive there is. So, yes.
Well, we're almost at 8:10. I think it's time for a few more questions. Unless you're tired of answering, tired of talking.
No, I'm not. No.
Some ice water?
No, I have some water here. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned people that have no religion. Are you
Mm-hmm.
seeing the same type of movement away from any kind of religion at all, like you see
Right.
in the United States?
Right, kind of more secular, right?
So you're
Or
seeing
or culturally Protestant. So again, something I wasn't able to incorporate into my lectures. One of the reasons why Protestantism isn't growing as fast now is there have been some major scandals. Similar to how American evangelicalism, like Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart, you have similar, and in fact, Full Gospel Church too. His sons were involved in some financial abuse and all sorts of scandals, and that has really hurt. And so a lot of the younger people feel, well, you go to church and you embezzle money and sex scandals and all, and so that's really tarnished the Korean church. And so many of the younger people are choosing just not, or convert to Roman Catholicism. There have been a lot of conversions over into, especially among millennials, going from Protestant to Roman Catholicism. Yes, Sarah.
Do you have an explanation why that's occurring, why they would go from Protestantism to Catholicism? Because certainly there are scandals, at least in this country.
Oh, right. But in Korea, you don't, I'm sure there's abuse taking place in South Korea as well as any other country, but so far that hasn't come to light, or the problem is, Roman Catholicism in South Korea hasn't suffered that kind of stigma of abuse. And also, I'm at St. Mary's, right, Anglo-Catholic, and so we get a lot of younger people, and I think they're more interested in this traditional spiritual, like incense and high church liturgy. I think that's part of it as well in South Korea, where those who grew up with contemporary Christian music and Protestant churches are like, oh, no, I'd rather have more like Gregorian chant and incense and something. I'm sorry. More mystical, yes. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think there's a kind of generational shift there. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Oh.
thank Susan Painter too, who.
Thank you, Susan.
Who helped for me,
Oh,
and who, wasn't in here. When was the last time you were in on? I know you.
2005.
I know you told me you felt a lot more home here than you do there.
Right, 2005 was the last time.
And you managed to go back and.
I hope to, yes.